Today, we're diving into an essential that often overlooked pillar of the modern power grid, and that's telecommunications. Because as utilities modernize their systems, digitize their operations, and bring more distributed energy resources online, one thing becomes clear. If you can't communicate with the grid, you can't control it. And yet, the telecom needs of utilities remain a second-tier concern in too many policy conversations. While commercial carriers auction off billions in wireless spectrum, utility operators tasked with powering our electrified future are left with what remains behind. Meanwhile, broadband build-outs are running into permitting conflicts over who owns the poles and what's safe to attach. So, to help us unpack these critical challenges, we're joined today by Rusty Williams, President and CEO of Utility Technology Council, the trade association representing the full spectrum utility telecom professionals across IOUs, co-ops, and municipal systems. And Rusty brings over 3 decades of experience across both utility operations and telecom infrastructure. And he is here to talk about why these technical systems are now so central to utility strategy. And as a reminder, you can catch every episode of Power Perspectives on the show notes with Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and wherever else you get your show subscriptions. Subscribe, leave us comments or ratings, and don't miss our other series you can find in these podcast feeds as well, like Piloting the Future, where we learn about the latest in innovation, and The Gist, where we dive deep into GIS technology for the power sector. I'm Jason Price, coming to you from New York City, and with me as always is Matt Chester, Community Manager and Podcast Producer based in Orlando, Florida. So, Matt, how often do these telecom topics come up when we're reviewing the pages of EnergyCentral.com?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. That's a great question. And I'd say these days, telecom, it's coming up more and more frequently on the pages of EnergyCentral.com by our community members. But I'll say it's often in ways that still show how maybe underappreciated it is. You know, we see articles about critical topics like grid modernization, DER integration, wildfire mitigation, metering, all of that. And implicit within each of those is telecommunications, which you can consider almost the unsung hero of those topics. So whether it's a utility trying to deploy sensors across their distribution network, build out a private LTE system for resiliency. So what's striking is how often utility professionals on our platform, they do call out the gap between what they need and what current policy or commercial offerings provide. So maybe sometimes the telecom infrastructure, it's not the headline, but it's core to that DNA of all the major transformations the grid is undergoing right now and that our community members are talking about. And that's why I think having Rusty with us today to bring the topic from the implicit to the more explicit is going to be so valuable.
That's great, Matt. Thank you for that. And thanks to West Monroe, our sponsor of today's episode. And now let's get to the main event and bring in today's guest. So, Rusty Williams, welcome to Energy Central's Power Perspectives podcast.
Jason, it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation and look forward to the conversation today.
All right. So, Rusty, set the stage for our audience. Can you give us a quick overview of the mission of UTC and how your role as CEO puts you at the intersection of grid modernization and telecom?
Yeah, UTC, for short, Utilities Technology Council, has been around over 75 years supporting utilities. 75 years ago, it was help them work with the FCC to get a radio license to be able to talk to their line trucks. But obviously, over that 75-year period, it has evolved to include many new technologies and requirements that have to be met within the utilities themselves. We represent all types of utilities, electric, water, gas. We represent all different types in terms of, investor owns versus municipals versus rural electric co-ops. And that creates part of a challenge when you look at issues such as telecommunications, IT type technologies, and cybersecurity. And that we work on, we work on advocacy issues. We help with technology education and other things, bring people together. But, while those groups are different, they have a lot of similarities, and we try to bring that together to help the industry as a whole.
All right. Well, I want to explore that a bit more. So you got IOUs, munis, co-ops, you got electric, water, gas. That's a pretty broad agenda, a full spectrum of views and opinions and such. How do you advocate? How do you prioritize?
Yeah, there's a lot more commonality than there are differences. I mean, it's pretty obvious that a large IOU may have a different need than an electric rural co-op, right? Or, the water guys versus the electric guys, urban versus rural. But when you look at the core issues, there's a lot more commonality. So, we never or rarely ever get to the point within UTC that we're really split over positions on issues, right? So whether, we're going to talk today about spectrum or pole attachments or, rural broadband funding and those sorts of things, most of us have common needs and, and objectives. So, we're working together collectively. And that's one thing that makes UTC different from some of the other organizations around. Everybody has their purpose, the EEIs and NRECAs and APPAs and all the other alphabet acronyms, right? But the thing that's different about UTC is we have that broad range of utilities. And so it makes it interesting on one hand, challenging on another hand, to bring those people together, those organizations, to be able to find positions related to technology to help the industry as a whole move forward.
Right. You mentioned spectrum, and I know enough to be dangerous. So I want to ask you, and I want you to go a little deeper in this. So utilities don't have dedicated wireless spectrum, although the grid is becoming increasingly modernized with more communications, more Internet of Things. What's the holdback? What's the cost of just maintaining the status? Why do we need this action now? Why do these investments need to be made? Help us understand a little of this.
Yeah, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, UTC started, 75 years ago, helping utilities work with the FCC to get a license just to be able to talk to their line trucks. So, radios and radio licenses, the allocation or assignment of spectrum has been an issue, but particularly over the last 10 to 15 years, as we've seen the evolution, and Matt was referencing it earlier, when you see some of the technologies on the electric grid itself, okay, you're not talking about dumb poles and wires and streetlights and transformers anymore, right? You're talking about intelligent devices that can monitor and manage the electric grid. We're not talking about, your IT network. We're talking about 60 cycle world here that is changing. And to have all these intelligent devices, gives you a lot more access. I mean, 20 years ago, we were putting, our first sensors on distribution lines, and you might have 3 or 5, sensors on a distribution feeder. Today, every house has a meter that can be talked to. Every street light just about can be talked to. All the devices, like transformers and voltage regulators and reclosers and all of that can also be talked to. So now instead of talking to 3 devices, you could be talking about 3,000 devices on a distribution feeder. And the only way to cost effectively talk to those devices, which you have to talk to them to be able to manage them and manage the system, the only way to talk to them effectively is through wireless systems, wireless on the edge. All right. There may be something else in the core of the network, but you've got to reach out and touch these streetlights or these sensors and these other things. So that puts more pressure, more importance on the wireless part of the business for the utilities. While, it's one thing to, hey, I need to talk to my line truck, but it's something else if the hurricanes come through, or we had a wildfire, or we have an ice storm, and everything, a lot of our facilities are lying on the ground, or we have impact, much like the outage in Spain, Portugal a couple of months ago. You've got to be able to talk those devices to get the systems back up and operating as quickly as possible, but also as safely as possible.
And I mean, these are critical systems. This is critical infrastructure, so we can't fool around here. So, all right, it's important to have real-time communications. The technology is available. Spectrum is in the market. How does the current spectrum policy environment hold back that vision? And we often hear about, what does the framework of the future look like? Can you talk about that? What does the framework of the future look like?
Yeah. So one more look backwards before we look forward. The one primary issue that we've always fought as utilities, critical infrastructure companies, is that there's never been an allocation and assignment of specific radio spectrum for use by critical infrastructure companies. So when we've needed a license, we've had to go out and compete against taxi cab companies, plumbers, fill in the blank type commercial entities that also use radio systems. So it's always been a challenge. But now, because of the criticality of these intelligent grid systems, we mentioned distributed energy resources earlier. You think about two-way electricity flow and how you manage that and how you bill for it. All those things puts these technologies in the critical path of the core utilities being successful. And that's successful from an operational perspective and from a financial perspective as well. I mean, you have great systems, but if you can't measure it and bill for it, it doesn't matter, in the end as well. So, I used to joke with people. I've been in the industry for a while, as you said, and when I would hire new people into our organization, and I did work for a utility for many years, especially early in my career, I would tell them, man, if you're coming into the telecom organization or what would have been in the IT organization back then, you want the limelight and the glory, you're in the wrong place. The utility executives don't know you exist unless whatever you do is broken. But now you fast forward 15 years, 20 years, and those systems are in the critical path. So they get a lot more visibility from the core utility executives, and pressure comes with that. Right? We've got to make sure we design systems and we operate systems to support the core mission of the utilities. And as we look at regulation for spectrum, we're trying to find the right mix. We're not asking for the world here, but we're helping FCC, DOE, DHS, type agencies understand the criticality and find a way to provide some alternatives that gives utilities some of the spectrum they need in a way that fits in with the rest of the world is fighting for that beachfront property as well.
Yeah, modernization is bringing the sexy back to the utilities.
I almost said that, and I'm an engineer way deep down in my soul, so I usually don't talk that way, right? But it's been hard to get technologists hired into the utility business over the years because it wasn't sexy. It wasn't Apple, it wasn't Google, it wasn't Facebook, fill in the blank phone company. So it was tough to attract those people, but that's beginning to change now. And some of those people with those level of talents are coming into the utility industry to help it become what it needs to become.
No, good point. All right. So we've had on the show in the past engineering firms and others who've talked about pole attachments and the challenges and the business models around pole attachments. Now we've got this big push for broadband out into, the last mile in many areas of the country that still don't have it, those kinds of connectivity. And of course, we're more connected than ever before as a country and as a society. So broadband continues to, the wiring on the poles and such is a major issue that needs to be considered. Tell us, what is UTC's position on that issue, and what's at stake for utilities and public safety around, something that's a necessity versus a nicety, or how do you balance all that? Help us, unwind this sort of hairy mess that we're looking at.
Yeah, this whole idea and concern over pole attachments is something that's been around for a long time. This is not a recent phenomenon. 20 years ago, we were talking about what we used to call the phone companies, attaching to poles. And today we're talking about broadband internet service provider type companies that are in the same type situation. The vast majority of the pole distribution poles that exist at least in the US are owned by the electric companies. All right. I don't know what the exact number is, but it's a large majority of the poles are owned by the electric companies. So that means that if somebody wants to come in, build a broadband system, provide internet service, they're going to want to attach to those poles to be able to build out those systems. There are challenges with that. Obviously, there's a physical structure. So, is it tall enough to maintain safety requirements? Is it strong enough to hold, what is being added to it? So there's a lot of concern about safety. You mentioned public safety. That's a big part of it. The other is just the integrity of the electric grid, right? I mean, you may have seen pictures of, third world countries where you look at an electric pole and there's 100 attachments to this pole, and it just looks like a rat's nest. Now, I realize that's an extreme, but, we're trying to make sure we don't go down that path where we have more attachments with virtually no oversight, so that, we don't degrade the quality of the electric service on top of, the safety issue. And, oh, by the way, somebody's got to pay for that work. So is there some equitable cost sharing associated with that? The electric companies are not trying to stand in the way of these systems. They're just trying to make sure the assets are protected, the public is protected, and we do it in a way that's fair to everybody.
Okay. I want to, there's no way to have a conversation on power perspectives without talking about the regulatory aspects. So let's dive in. I'd love to hear your perspective on some of the regulatory, decision-making that's going on. I mean, we know that utilities have for a long time been considered among the slowest to move as an industry. We've talked about that. We know that the government side may even work more slowly, but the problems are arising. the attention in government and the commissions are addressing these kinds of awareness from an affordability standpoint, from a reliability standpoint, and from a performance standpoint. So there's a lot of attention around, from the regulators on their perspectives and how to manage all this. Are we seeing a shift towards greater momentum in the policy and regulatory landscape? I assume you're talking to these people in one form or another, whether it's the regulatory office of the utilities or even sitting on some of these commission hearings. What are you seeing, and what can you share with us?
Yeah, you are correct. Utilities in general have had the history of being slow to react. And there's reasons for that. Again, you don't want to do anything that's going to jeopardize safety in the areas that the utilities serve. In fact, when I started, the first job I had in utility was a distribution engineer. And this is before the days of, a lot of computers and other things. And we had these printed distribution standards books that, were on the shelf, and I had an older engineer. Probably the first week I was at work, working for a utility, looked at me and said, "Do you see those books right there? Is your designing projects? If it's not in those books, I don't want to hear it." It's like, there's standards for a reason. Right now, that's the way it was, but the mentality still exists. All right. So we are a little slow to adopt new technologies or new ways of doing business. But if there's any part of the world that's slower than that, it's the federal government. Right. So the federal government also, and somewhat by design, is slow to move, just again, for safety and for to keep someone from coming in and taking over the world. We're going through the early days of a new administration now. And, that's part of the turmoil in Washington, D.C. is there's a lot of immediate actions being taken. Now, whether you like them or not, agree with them or not, whatever, that's a different conversation. But it's kind of turning over the status quo of, hey, we've got to do something. We've got to do something in a hurry. We've got to address this issue. So we see some impact of that. But when it comes down to just the core business of the federal government, unfortunately, I'm not seeing a lot of new speed being picked up in these areas. We do talk, like as I mentioned earlier, the FCC a lot, Department of Energy and Homeland Security and several others. They have their mechanisms, they have their processes, they have their ways of accomplishing things. And unfortunately, it's not things that we need, or other industries for that matter, but the things that utilities need from a regulatory perspective are not going to happen in a hurry. So we've got to work on the slow change, and that's got to be part of what we do. But the other part is we've got to find ways around any regulatory barriers that we might have. Now, I'm not advocating do something illegal, but find the ways that you can accomplish what you want to accomplish without getting outside the lines. So it's a challenge, quite honestly. I've been in this job a year and a half now, and I have been around the DC environment off and on through the years. And, sometimes we go to meetings and we come out scratching our heads going, how does anything ever get done? But there are some days we're going, you know what? We had a great conversation with that group of people, and I think maybe we can get some changes made.
I want to go back to the telecom in the hierarchy of the utilities. So, I mean, you've got a lengthy and storied career in the industry. You've considerable time at the utilities, both as an employee of the utility and then as on the service side of things. So, with the grid modernizing, there is just so much that needs to get done. I feel like in the pecking order, telecom is not at the top, not even in maybe say the top 5. Perhaps not, depending on what state and all that. Help us understand, what is the biggest, say, misconception that utility leaders or regulators still have about the role of telecom at the utilities?
Let me give you two answers to that question. One, I think, as we mentioned a little bit earlier, I think some of those perceptions inside the utility are starting to change. They're beginning, particularly executives, right, are beginning to see that if I want to do AMI 2.0, the next iteration of, automated metering, or I want to do some intelligent grid implementations, that's the telecommunications and IT parts of those networks have got to be part of the conversation. It's interesting, though, to see the magnitude, because many large utilities are considering building their next generation wireless networks, which is basically the same LTE technology that the commercial cellular companies are using. And to be able to go acquire the spectrum, which means you have to buy it, sometimes at auction, and to build out these networks, we're talking about, hundreds of millions of dollars for some of the larger utilities. And that's not small change. Even if you're talking about, the largest utilities in the U.S., that's a conversation you have to have with the CEO, right? Do we do that? So some of that education is coming along for the last 5 years or so. So I think, within the utilities, I think there's a lot of increased understanding, or at least some ideas, floating that, this might really be important. The other misconception that I'll mention that's more outside of the utility world, the utility executives, and it is in part of the regulatory environment, is this idea of, why can't we just let the commercial cellular networks handle all this stuff for us? Why do you have to go build another network, Mr. Utility? And when you've got one there already. So we do a lot of education with people to help them understand why that's not a good idea. Right? Those systems were built to a certain design spec, and it's a consumer grade, best effort system that covers the area where the people are. All right. And that's their business model. I'm not, downgrading it. That's their business model and their design criteria. But when you look at the criticality of the network in terms of the grid, the systems are designed with 5 nines of reliability, which means you're averaging about 5 minutes worth of outage time on these networks over the course of a year. Then that's completely different, than the commercial systems. So helping people understand the difference in the way those systems are designed and operated. If you looked at any of the news reports from the Spanish and Portuguese outage, transmission outage from a couple of months ago, you'll see that in that area, most of the commercial systems went down because they weren't designed to survive events like that. And, they have small amounts of battery backup in these cell sites. And when you have a major outage, when again, fill in the blank, disaster, hurricanes, ice storms, wildfires, those systems go down and are down for days.
Right. If you and I were talking on a mobile phone and the call drops, we can just call each other back. But if it drops within the system, it could be the difference between life and death.
If I want to close a breaker in a transmission substation and I can't talk to it, then that's a problem. It could be a safety problem, but it's definitely an operational problem. So that's a misconception that we continue to work on. But again, it's mostly not within the utility itself. It's with some regulators and some other entities that play around in this space. But we'll slowly kind of chipping away at that.
All right, so let's go back to UTC and the mission of UTC. I mean, what I really admire about your organization is that there's a lot of education, certainly there's advocacy, certainly there's, I don't know if you're a lobbying organization or not. You can correct me there if I'm wrong, but most importantly, it's the education. It's educating the next generation of leaders. It's basically to get the message out of the importance and cross-train and cross-pollinate people's perspectives around the telecom infrastructure at the utility level. So with that aside, though, what are some upcoming milestones or advocacy that you are looking at for the future that we should be thinking about and keep an eye on to see what comes next with UTC?
When you look at the things that we do at a high level, I kind of put them in 3 buckets, and you really touched on them for the most part just then. It's the advocacy work, the lobbying efforts that we do to try to help shape the regulatory environment. So that's one of them. Education is one of them. In fact, this year we're starting a new program, a new educational platform we're calling the UTC Academy. It will be officially announced in a couple of weeks. It's targeted at this industry, at the technologies or the non-technical issues related to this industry. And so, that's one way to do that. The third bucket is what we call collaboration. Maybe it's membership engagement. We bring people together, right? Whether it's physically at a conference or virtually in some kind of committee meeting or whatever, let people share. Get to know the person that does your job in the utility next door, or you find out that somebody else on the other side of the country is considering or has already implemented a technology that you're considering. And you bring those people together and let them talk and get to know each other and learn from their experiences. That is one of the most, if not the most valuable part of being a UTC member from my perspective. So it's, advocacy work, education, and that engagement. When you look at the issues, gosh, we talked about them, right? We talked about spectrum. We talked about funding and rules for rural broadband build-outs. That's a whole different conversation. We have some members that are wanting to do that, but, federal red tape and bureaucracy has been a challenge for some of them, and it's been slow to get that funding out to those people. And the whole idea of cybersecurity, with a critical infrastructure industry like this, I mean, the bad actors are looking at ways to come in and disrupt, right? 20 years ago, we were thinking about if somebody wanted to do it, you pull a truck up next to a substation that's got explosives in it. But now you can sit behind a computer in wherever on the other side of the world and try to hack your way in and just turn systems off, and when the power goes off, the world's not the same until it comes back on. So that's kind of the three areas, that we're focusing on, in addition to those functions that we talked about.
Sure. And I'm sure AI is working its way into those conversations as well.
You know what? When I started bringing up AI, all the utility people are going, that's not anything I got to worry about. But as we continue to talk, we're actually publishing soon, within the next couple of weeks, kind of a fundamental base artificial intelligence white paper. What does it mean to utilities? Why do I care? All those kind of things. And then I think we're going to build on it with a couple of more iterations of it. But that could change. I mentioned earlier, thousands of sensors. The human minds can only comprehend so much of that at a time. But if we can bring these AI type systems in to be able to not only see it, but make some sense out of things that are going on, I think that's going to be a big leap forward for this industry.
Okay. Well, I mean, slow adoption is their middle name. So why would AI be something they would immediately jump on, right? So
you're absolutely correct. That's part of the challenge.
All right. Well, Rusty, this has been phenomenal. And, you're living to the mission of UTC, which is providing insight and sharing knowledge. So I want to thank you for that. And we're going to give you the final word, but we first want to learn a little bit more about you, the person, rather than you, the professional. So today we're going to bring Matt back into the conversation. He's going to throw some lightning round questions. This is our lightning round series where we're going to throw a question at you, and we ask you to, provide a response, one word or phrase response to each of the questions. So are you ready?
I'm ready.
Let's do it. So Rusty, you're obviously a big tech guy. So I'm curious, what's your favorite, maybe under the radar app that you use on a regular basis?
I don't know that I've got one, but the area of home automation is intriguing to me. So looking at, your security systems and thermostats and even my sprinkler system at home. So I play with that a good bit and trying to figure out what I can do with it.
What is your go-to road trip snack? You're gearing up at a gas station. What are you grabbing?
If you know me, this is an easy one. All right. It's a honey bun. If you've seen the pastries in the convenience stores, not just the regular honey bun. I want the iced honey buns. So it's really not good for you, but it can give you a sugar kick to get you to wherever you're going.
Who would be at your dream dinner party? And I hope you're serving something other than honey buns there.
Well, you never know, but that's, I'm intrigued by various people. One, I'm going to give you three names. One is Elon Musk. And this has nothing to do with politics, just understanding him as an individual, as an entrepreneur, his background, and give you a very interesting person to sit and talk to over dinner. So that's one. Tiger Woods. Again, I mentioned golf earlier. So, but it's as much about, what has he learned in the last 10 years? How has his life changed, and what has he learned in the last 10 years? And the last one is Condoleezza Rice. So it's someone from my home state of Alabama, someone that was able to achieve her dreams and achieve greatness through her life. And, having that conversation with her, I think would be very interesting as well.
Absolutely. I'd love to be a fly on the wall at that party. So something we're doing recently is we collect lightning round questions from our past podcast guests to ask the future guests, kind of a pass it on deal. So a recent conversation we had with Michael Stadler at Zendy, he posited this question of, what was your dream job when you were a child growing up?
Yeah, I didn't know what it was called, but it was basically an engineer, right? I love to learn new things, to try new things, accomplish tasks, even as a child in school or Boy Scouts or, whatever that we were involved with. But I would say, looking back at it, I wanted to be an engineer, but at that particular time, depending on what age it was, I didn't even know what an engineer was, if you were to throw the word out.
Right. Well, that's awesome that you got to live it. And then now it's your turn. Where, is there a question you want to leave for a future podcast guest? And it could be related to energy and utilities, or it can be off the wall, kind of like the questions I asked you.
One of my favorite ones to ask people is, back to the golf analogy, what is one career mulligan that you would like to take? What's the one thing when you look back across your career you wish you could have done differently? And, from this point looking backwards. So I think it's interesting to hear how people answer that question. I've got one or two myself, or one or two answers to that. But, I think if you ask someone, one of your future guests that, I think you may get some interesting answers.
I think so. I love that. And then lastly, what are you most motivated by?
Yeah, I'm not motivated by money. I'm not necessarily motivated by accolades. It's more about personal achievement. Can I accomplish what I'm setting out to accomplish, and the satisfaction that comes with that. I will back up a little bit. I did have a boss one time, and he was a great leader, having a good conversation. And I told him one day, I said, you know what? I don't need a lot of care and feeding, but every now and then you have to tell me you love me. Right. So just ever so often you can do that. But other than that, to me, it's about a personal achievement and accomplishment is what drives me.
That was great. Great questions, great responses. Thank you, Rusty. Thank you, Matt, for doing that. So, Rusty, we say we give you the final word, and we want to give you the opportunity to send one message to a CEO or utility leader that's listening today who hasn't necessarily prioritized telecom investments yet. So what would you want them to take away from this conversation?
Yeah, if you don't know who your IT and telecommunications people are in your corporation, go find them. Go figure out who they are, and start having conversations with them so you better understand that part of your business. It's as we've talked about for the last several minutes, it's a challenge that's continuing to grow, and many utility executives may not know the value or even who those people are. Less likely these days, but go find them, have a conversation with them, and start integrating them into your more traditional core planning efforts. I think you'll reap the benefits for it.
That's great. That's great. And Rusty, you represent a very important organization, UTC, and clearly you're an important voice and a valuable leader. So I'm sure your members appreciate all the hard work and advocacy you've been doing, and the industry at large thanking you for the leadership that you've presented and talked about today. So until then, we want to thank you for joining the episode, and you certainly stay engaged with the Energy Central community. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and comments posted, and keep the conversation going. So again, thank you for your insight and joining us in today's episode.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
And you can always reach Rusty through the Energy Central platform, where he welcomes your questions and comments. So Matt, that was a great conversation. You did a great job. What stood out for you in what you heard today?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. That was a great conversation. And as we hinted at kind of throughout, it's not one that I think we dive into enough on the podcast or on energycentral.com. But the little earworm that I think that stuck with me is when you two are talking about the idea that you brought up, hey, telecom is kind of bringing sexy back here. And you said, yeah, you joke, but it's kind of true. This is an interesting technological problem and area that's getting engineers excited. And I think we see a lot of conversation on energycentral.com about, challenges in the workforce. How do the utilities compete with the Apples and the Googles and the big tech of the world with that hot talent, the new graduates, the people who want to be, at the front line of interesting technologies. And, historically, the utilities haven't really been able to attract those because in a lot of the ways, the utilities have been stagnant. That's kind of the nature of the industry. But with this telecom angle, he kind of highlighted how, hey, this is something that we can push to try to compete for those top talents. And those talents, I think, are going to be important to taking the utility to the next level. So, hearing his thoughts about that, I think that's a takeaway that I didn't expect to come away. And he kind of highlighted also, UDC doing some of the educational platforms, I think, to really hammer that home. So that was really interesting to hear about, and wasn't a direction I thought this conversation was going to go, but it makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know if that's something that you had heard in the telecom and utility nexus.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's been a challenge across the board. No matter what department you're in at the utility, it's a challenge. So what stood out for me is, with the utilities, this is a critical infrastructure play, right? And there's not much that the utilities, acquire from a technology standpoint that's readily available for the marketplace. It's really everything that's built and designed is customized for them. So to hear that, the telecom component, which is basically the communication backbone to operate this critical infrastructure, runs on a commercially available phone plan like you and I have. Knowing that the utilities have a friend and family plan with your local, your national provider, there's a little eye-opening and surprising. And that's certainly, what we're talking about with Rusty was all about, trying to move away from that, and how the utilities are looking at the telecom component to the critical infrastructure differently than they have in the past. So that's what stood out for me, and I'm sure that also connected with people who may be listening to this today. So yeah, so thank you for that.
Absolutely. No, and that, I think that's a great point, and it he brought up the limited resources as well. There's only so many bandwidths to sell, and it's there's kind of a battle over it. So not only is it the friends and family plan, but maybe there's only so many of those plans to sell out there. So that's creating some natural problems. You have limited resources and unlimited needs. So no easy solution there, but that's why we need experts like Rusty here to guide us and share their insights.
And also want to give a quick thank you to our sponsor of today's episode. That's West Monroe. West Monroe is a leading partner for the nation's largest electric, gas, and water utilities, working together to drive grid modernization, clean energy, and workforce transformation. West Monroe's comprehensive services are designed to support utilities in advancing their digital transformation, building resilient operations, securing federal funding, and providing regulatory advisory support. With a multidisciplinary team of experts, West Monroe offers a holistic approach that addresses the challenges of the grid today and provides innovative solutions for a sustainable future. And once again, I'm your host, Jason Price. Plug in and stay fully charged in the discussion by hopping into the community at energycentral.com. And we'll see you next time at the Energy Central Power Perspectives Podcast.